Hey there guys, Botstoa here. Today what I got for you is a discussion on the topic of cheek filter masks. Because, well, you see, a lot of people in the gas mask collecting and militaria collecting communities believe that cheek filters are bad and that any mask that uses them was inherently awful. And, well, I strongly disagree with that. But before we get into why I think they were actually really good, there's three things that I need to explain first. Firstly, I need to explain what this video is not saying. I am not saying that cheek filter masks are currently good. They are fully obsolete. All I am saying is that the cheek filter design was good at its time. Second, we need to define what cheek or pork chop filters are. So, cheek and pork chop filters are synonymous, and I will probably be using them interchangeably. As for what they are internal, removable, and low-profile filters. They get their names through the fact that they typically conform to the cheek, or that they look like pork chops. All of the masks that I've got in front of you here are examples of masks that use pork chop filters. Specifically, what I've got here is a Czech M10M, a Chinese Type 65, an M17A2 from the United States, of course, and a Soviet SHMB from the PBF kit. Anyways, the third thing that we need to discuss before we get to the actual point of this video is why people think cheek filters are bad. When it comes to pork chop filters being bad, I've only ever seen two arguments. The first one is that the filters are very difficult to change. That's just flat out true, and I will grant that argument. Well, for now at least. We will talk about it more later in the video. The second argument, and the one that I am more interested in talking about today, is that you cannot change the filters in a contaminated environment. Which, I mean, that is true. I mean, like, objectively that is true, but it doesn't really matter, and I'll tell you why. And that's because on any gas mask, historical or modern, changing the filter in a contaminated environment is inherently super fucking dangerous. And so it has been historically avoided in military doctrine. So yeah, when it comes to most gas masks, you are just straight up not supposed to do it anyways. You might ask why it's so dangerous that it has resulted in a near universal doctrinal avoidance. Well, let's actually walk through the process of changing that filter. Oh yeah, and for this walkthrough, we are going to be assuming that you have a threaded canister. Well, the first step is becoming aware that you need to change your filter. Now, most people have the idea in their head that, well, you just set a timer for how long the filter lasts, and when it starts to beep, you change your filter. But how long do you actually set that timer to? There are an absolute ton of different variables that affect how long your filter lasts. For instance, the rate at which you're breathing, which is affected by how you're exerting yourself, the level of humidity in the air, the means of deployment of the chemical weapon, or the initial concentration of it, as well as the rate of dispersion, which is affected by another great many variables, like the way the wind is blowing, or how many trees are in the area, or even the ambient temperature. And then there's also the issue of what chemical weapon is it? Is it even a chemical weapon? Different things affect your filter in different ways. You know, there are just so many variables that determine your filter lifespan that it's really almost impossible to predict. But let's assume that you have found the perfect system and you can accurately predict when your filter is about to expire. The next thing you need to do is acquire a new filter and unseal it. This provides another major issue, but we're going to talk about it after this walkthrough. You now need to take a deep breath and remember not to exhale any air, as you will be needing it later. Remove your current filter and install the new one. And at this point, you need to clear your mask. You put your hand over the exhale valve and exhale hard. You need to do this not only because there is going to be a guaranteed pocket of contaminated air within the stem of the filter, but it's possible that there could also be contaminated air in the mask. But once you've done that, you've cleared your mask. But how many of you guys honestly noticed that I missed a step? And if you didn't notice, that's fine. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's a very easy step to forget. And it's especially easy to forget when you're in a stressful scenario like, you know, exposing yourself to chemical weapons in a scenario like a battlefield where you're absolutely going to get shot at some point. And that step that I didn't mention earlier is that you're supposed to close your eyes. And well, you need to do that because when you clear the mask, that contaminated air that is trapped between the filter and the inlet valve is going to enter your mask and pay a visit to your face. Now, of course, it's going to be a rather minor exposure, but there are chemical weapons out there like nerve agents, which both the United States and Soviet Union were stockpiling, that don't really care that it was a minor exposure and they'll kill you anyways. But let's pretend for a second here that you are using a hosed mask. Right here, I've got a Davis part number 3040 in M1 configuration, and I'm using this because it was right next to me and I didn't want to get up. But let's just imagine that this is like an SHMS or SHM41 or something like that. You now have a lot more contaminated air to deal with, which makes that initial problem way, way worse. But anyhow, at this point, you have now successfully changed your filter in a contaminated environment, if you were indeed successful. And now I also hope that you see why this is such a dangerous ordeal, and why militaries have avoided it since World War I. What I've got here is the mask that preceded the M17, which is the M9A1, and the mask that replaced it, the M40, but this is an M40A1. And we're not actually looking at these masks today. Instead, we are looking at their carriers. Now, if you're familiar with either of these carriers, something you might have noticed is they don't actually have the space to carry two filters, the one fixed to the mask and a spare. And even if that weren't the case, even if it did have the space for the spare, it doesn't even have a pocket or pouch or anything where you could actually keep the spare. And this is the case with most gas mask carriers ranging from World War I to today. Note that I said most. I know that the M50 carrier, for instance, well, it has a secondary carrier for spare filters, and there's also something like the East Garbubian Model 69A21. You know, I know there's carriers that don't follow this rule, but most do. And that's because you're not supposed to change your filter in a contaminated environment, so they don't even give you that spare. Anyhow, my point here is that when people call the M17 or any other cheek filter mask bad, they compare them to the country of origin's threaded designs, typically, because in gas mask collecting FUD lore, these filters can be changed in a contaminated environment. When in reality, you physically cannot do that with these filters because you don't have the spares. Now, I can see the argument that this problem wouldn't exist if it weren't for the doctrine, but I think that point is moot because this is the reality of these masks' use. I'm sure at this point many of you guys are wondering what the alternative is if you're not supposed to change your filters in a contaminated environment. It's called gear swap, or gear exchange, or mop swap. I've seen it called a lot of different things. And, well, I can't really say what it is without describing how it works, so I will just describe how it works. Firstly, there are two echelons, one in the rear that is held in reserve, and one in the front that is actually on some sort of mission. At some point during the mission, well within the expected service life of the filters, the echelons are swapped. The units that were held in reserve are put out to the front lines, while the ones in the front lines are moved to the rear for decontamination. The former front echelon is now held in reserve so that they can be decontaminated and have their gear swapped, so that when it is time to swap the echelons again, they can go back to the front lines. This results in nearly a seamless continuity of the operation without any sort of increase to individual level risk. So yes, technically gear swap is what happens when that front echelon arrives at the rear echelon and actually, removes their chemical suits and decontaminates and stuff like that. But overall, the switching of echelons is what prevents warfighters from having to actually expose themselves to chemical agents through changing their filter in a contaminated environment. This has actually been the case for over a century at this point. This is a Bureau of Mines box respirator from 1917. You might notice that the filter is actually fixed to the mask via wire and tape. that cannot be and is not intended to be removed by the end user. The mask that this is based on, Britain's smallpox respirator from the year prior, holds that in common. This right here is an American Navy diaphragm Mark IV from World War II. This mask also uses wire and fabric tape to secure the filter to the mask. And here's the also American M2-10A16 lightweight optical mask from the Korean War. As you can see, this also uses the wire and fabric tape. And when we take into account the fact that the M9 and M40 also don't have the ability to change their filters in a contaminated environment, the M17 no longer appears to be some sort of doctrinal aberration. So by this point in the video, I think I've pretty soundly debunked the main issue that people have with the M17 and other cheek filter masks. But the point of this video is to say that cheek filters or Porkchop filters were good, that they were a good idea, so why don't I get into explaining why? And the main reason for that is cheek filters are supposed to reduce user burden, and Porkchop or cheek style filters have a significant advantage in that field when compared to canisters. Because, well, instead of having this giant canister, you've got two very low profile filters. In most cases, I haven't forgotten about the T65 back there. So for the cost of just a little bit of bulk on both sides, you get a more balanced, more comfortable mask that can't be snagged on branches and things, that also has a lower level of overall bulk. And when you compare all those advantages to the admittedly very real disadvantage of it being a giant pain in the ass to change the filters, that disadvantage doesn't really look all that bad. In the eyes of the militaries that adopted masks with Porkchop style filters, those benefits outweighed the downside. That brings us to the end of our analysis on cheek filters. Next up, we'll be doing some very fun meta commentary on the mask collecting community. And honestly, I'm gonna be rehashing a lot of stuff that I said back in the 75M video, so if you get the idea, feel free to leave now. Cheek filters being bad is one of the most common opinions held by this community, and I want to answer the question of why that is. And the answer is actually surprisingly simple. It's because we are modern collectors, and our only experiences with these masks are the ones we have as collectors. We need to change our own filters, I mean. So after we try for 20 minutes to remove the filters and then look up a YouTube tutorial on how to do it, and then spend another 45 minutes trying to do it, only to finally get one out with our fingers hurting and red, and then realize we still gotta do another one, we begin to really feel that disadvantage. And from there, it becomes really easy to ignore the actual historical context of these masks. I mean, these are comically hard to change the filters on, while with an M9 you can just unthread it and rethread it. And I bet if there were some situation where you had to change these filters under pressure, you would be wishing you had an M9 right about now. But, you know, in reality, that was accounted for and prevented entirely. And I mean, once you've changed these filters a few times, you kind of get used to it. And the people that were actually changing these filters were the only ones who were supposed to change these filters, so they were doing it a lot, and they could get it done pretty darn quickly. In fact, I think the YouTuber Ghost Pepper has a video where he does exactly that, change Porkchop filters very quickly, and if that's still up, I will link to it in the description. This is now my third video talking about why historical context is important. I'm sure you can tell that this topic is important to me. This channel doesn't just exist so I can flex my collection of undesirable half-face respirators from the 90s, it also exists to spread information and improve the quality of dialogue in this community. And the biggest part of that is to step back and assail your own opinions. So if you've got a opinion of any sort on masks, step back and look at it and go, well, what is this opinion based on? And you know, everyone falls victim to the mindset that I've described today. That includes myself. In my previous videos and on posts I've made and conversations I've had, I have repeatedly stated that masks from HS Cover Co. sucked. And I deeply regret saying that because I feel like I have spread misinformation about a topic that I am passionate about. And the same goes for when I unknowingly spread misinformation about the OM 2020 and the Thai MT09, claiming that the MT09 was a prototype of the OM 2020. That was just wrong. And I don't think I ever thanked Forest Man for correcting me in that regard. He was the one that actually told me, "Hey, this is fucking wrong and here's proof." But anyways, I have gotten very off topic. My stated opinion used to be that masks from HS Cover Co were really bad. But I mean, frankly, they weren't. At the time, they were on par with everything else and technologically contemporary or even a little advanced for their era. In fact, this mask, the Sesco number 92, that's going to be in a future video, was actually the subject of a successful lawsuit because Sesco stole innovations from HS Cover Co. And when they were found guilty of that, this thing had to stop being produced. Oh, and also all the money that was made selling these got forked over to HS Cover Co. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say here, though, is that this happens to everyone, and it's part of the process. This hobby is about learning and growing, and you just can't do that without making mistakes. And with that, I think I have run out of things to say, so I will finally shut the fuck up. In a minute. I still gotta do my outro, you know. Yeah, this was a video I've been planning on making for a year now, so I'm glad I finally went and did it, but I also want to hear your thoughts on this stuff, so be sure to leave a comment. That's my call to action, get my algorithm reach up. And if you have any big questions, you can actually email me now. In my link tree in the description, I've got an email. That is my business email. You can contact me there. And as always, thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next one, whenever that is.